Today we're reviewing this stout case. This is the Lian Li O11 Air Mini. It has had a massive change since the original videos came out a couple weeks ago, where the front panel is now different. It looks about the same from there at least, but the change has been in the porosity, or the amount of holes per given area in the front panel. And that change, despite not looking too different visually, has had a huge impact on thermal performance. So we're gonna be benchmarking the old panel versus the new one today. The old panel did not ship to customers, but the new one will be, and it will be soon. And then we're reviewing the case as it is for everything else we normally do. Build quality, value, and thermals, noise, all of that stuff. And that, again, is for the O11 Air Mini. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. We use Squarespace for our own GN store and juggle complex, multi-piece orders all the time with it. Squarespace makes it fast for us to roll out new products with detailed pages full of galleries, videos, and descriptors. It's also useful for your own resume sites, for photographer or project portfolios, or for starting your new small business idea. There's never been a better time to try and start your new business than right now. And we can vouch that Squarespace makes it easy. Visit squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So before anything else, we'll talk about the mesh. Lian Li said that basically it had a manufacturing error where the wrong panel was made or the wrong design was made for those initial cases. Oops, not sure how many were made, but that's expensive to fix because they're replacing it. Now, to Lian Li's credit, that's the right thing to do. And this product would have gotten a very different result in our conclusion if Lian Li didn't ever replace that panel, because it had a big impact on thermal performance. So that's the difference. Now the case is supposed to be $110. All the other stuff that you may have seen remains mostly the same, but this is the first time we've done a review on it. We had started our review when Lian Li said, probably stop because we're gonna change the case and so it won't represent the final product anymore. The O11 Air Mini basically gets rid of filters, which is good. Dust filters, if they're implemented excessively, actually just make things a lot worse. This case instead uses the ultra-fine mesh approach that a lot of modern cases use, where they just use very, well, fine and densely populated holes in a panel and then allow that to filter most of the dust. And that avoids double stacking filters. So this filters on the front, on the top. It's got some side mesh over here as well. And then there is an actual filter underneath the case. As for the changes, on September 23rd, Lian Li posted the following message on Facebook. It said, after a thorough examination of the first batch of O11 Air Mini retail units, we found the mesh panel pattern used in manufacturing to be different than the intended design. The intended design, which has 2 times the mesh density, can improve CPU thermal performance by as much as 5 degrees Celsius based on in-house testing. Rather than launching the case as is, we've decided to completely retool new panels for the O11 Air Mini and regret to announce that we will have to postpone the pre-orders by another 2 months. So first of all, this is good in the sense that Lian Li deserves some credit for not just pushing it out the door as is, knowing that it would probably receive poor reviews, in some cases knowing that it wasn't the best product it could be or the one that it should be. We do, however, have our doubts with the wording of this announcement. It seems that rather than being oops, a mistake, we made the wrong one. Maybe it's more of a, we started doing testing and realized that the so-called intended design is actually a new design after Lian Li saw its results. It doesn't make much difference, but we received an updated final production model for use in thermal testing. We'll show you the old results too. And just for a recap, this originally shipped to reviewers in about September, and it looks like they're going to be selling the thing and shipping it to customers probably in November. Let's get started with the build section and quality overview for this $110 case. Then we'll talk about thermal performance and noise. This diagram from Lian Li shows the old mesh design versus the new mesh design. And note that the panels are painted steel, so the actual hole diameter varies slightly from this. There's another hole spacing diagram used as decoration on the product page for the O11 Air Mini. Originally, that diagram was extremely incorrect, and it's now been upgraded to only mildly incorrect, which is the best kind of incorrect. The diameter and pitch numbers in this before and after picture are the true ones. The math is accurate, but we also confirmed that the measurements line up with the actual product. There are approximately 572 holes in a 5 centimeter square, which with a 1.5 millimeter hole diameter equals 40.4% open porosity. The main problem we have with the O11D Mini is that it's a mid-tower pretending to be a small form factor case, and therefore it falls short in both categories. There's an optional motherboard tray extension for ATX boards, but it's not sturdy. And the case can't fit ATX power supplies at all. That's, again, the original, not this new one. The O11D Mini is about 43 liters in total volume by Lian Li's count. For a comparison, the Corsair 4000D mid-tower is about 47 liters, while the Cooler Master NR200P, a small form factor chassis, is just over 20 liters when including its feet. The Dynamic Mini is close in size to a standard ATX PC case, yet it has lackluster support for standard ATX components. The Mini Air is shaped differently and comes out to just over 44 liters, but it utilizes that size effectively to have a natively ATX-sized motherboard tray and ATX power supply support. If the Air Mini isn't pretending to be an SFF case, that raises another issue. A full-size O11 Air already exists, and it wasn't particularly good. The Air Mini differs from its larger relative in more ways than size, though. Our most significant complaint with the original Air design was that it was bad for airflow, but also that the magnetic filters used by Lian Li were overly restrictive, resulting in it being bad for airflow. Once you took them out, it did okay. It was fine. But the Mini variant here disposes of magnetic filters basically altogether. The only filter in the case is a sliding nylon mesh one below the bottom intake slots, while the side panels themselves are a fine metal mesh rather than the plastic covers on the normal Air. This is much better. Fit and finish is generally good on Lian Li cases, but they screwed up this time. We had more issues than usual. On the new unit we received with updated panels, one of the top captive thumb screws was missing, and two of the expansion slot cover screws were torqued down so hard that the heads of them sheared off when we attempted to loosen them. These screws were over-tightened in our original review sample as well, but we've never had this happen. It's unique. We've been complaining about NDXT's screw tightness for about 9 years now, but they've never sent us a sheared bolt. This is easily one of the most insane mistakes and quality control issues we've seen in a case, barring, fire. But that's mostly because it's just unbelievably bereft of basic ability and QC. Hopefully Lian Li spends the next 2 months it has refining its production and assembly process. One of the most unique features of the O11 Mini models is the modular back panel. The entire rear of the case can be unscrewed and shifted downwards to slots, reducing the motherboard compatibility to Mini ITX and Micro ATX and reducing expansion slot count to 5. The benefit of doing so is that it adds an additional 4 centimeters of clearance above the motherboard's top edge. This original Mini also had a 3-slot mode. The Air partially retains the old tooling, but it eliminates this mode by merging one of the modular 2-slot groups into the back panel assembly. On both models, the rear panel pieces fit together tightly and tend to get wedged when reconfiguring the case. Installing cards into specific slots is difficult because there's no way to get a good angle on them with the driver. This is hard to describe, but the bottom line is that in the O11D Mini, 4 of the expansion slots were a pain in the ass, and in the O11 Air Mini, only 3 of the expansion slots are a pain in the ass. Extra ventilation has also been added to the modular slots in the Mini Air, so this is a bit of an upside. Another major difference from the O11D Mini and the Air Mini is that it swaps the hard drive and power supply bays, placing the hard drive bays on top in the Air Mini, and the hard drive bay itself is simplified overall. The original O11 Mini's sleds are the same as the full-size model, with metal handles and plastic rails screwed into the sides. The Air Mini sleds are simplified, presumably for cost, but they also work better, so that's fine. The drive cage is great overall. Plugging in the SATA connectors still takes some work, but making the cage accessible through a door in the back of the case is much more convenient than sticking it under a power supply shroud as an afterthought, so we liked this. One strange aspect that has stuck around for every iteration of the O11 thus far is the small countersunk screw at the bottom of the cable cover. The cover is otherwise easy to work with, slotting in with 2 tabs at the bottom edge and fastened with a captive thumb screw at the top. And simply undo the thumb screw as long as it doesn't shear in half, pull on the cover, and bend the case. And then realize that you forgot to undo the tiny screw at the bottom of the cover. Taking the screw out is an option, as is removing the cable cover altogether and relying obviously on the Velcro straps. Underneath the cover is an unusually deep cable channel with plenty of room for any power supply cable slack. Longer power supplies will eat this space, but even the 200mm maximum claimed by Lian Li would leave some space for cables above the power supply or behind the side vents if they aren't used. The amount of clearance is impressive, given that the non-Air O11 Mini can't fit ATX power supplies at all. Unfortunately, we found that the cable channel was so deep that it's difficult to reach the included Velcro straps. Instead, we found it easier to take the straps out, strap the cables into one big bundle, and tuck that bundle back into the case. Cable management is easy, with cutouts above and below the motherboard despite the case's short stature and gigantic cutouts along the side of the motherboard. The cutouts on the cable bar are poorly placed though, because the bar, although it has a different design from the O11 Minis, remains a problem common to both cases. If the drives are mounted on the outer face of the bar, the cutouts don't line up well with flat or right angle connectors. We recommend sticking to the 2 hard drive sleds when possible, since even in the best case scenario, mounting drives to the cable bar makes removing the bar annoying. Secondly, routing the cables through the cutouts below the ATX motherboard is extremely difficult with the power supply installed, and practically impossible if both the power supply and some bottom intake fans are installed. The rim of the case prevents reaching under the power supply to guide wires through a maze of cutouts and power supply supports. And finally, there's only one cutout for front fan cables at the top of the case, and the fan routing is limited by cable length at about 50 centimeters. I/O is 2 USB 3.0 Type A ports, 1 USB 3.1 Type C port, and 1 4-pole audio jack. We advocate for separate mic and headphone jacks on the grounds that they offer more flexibility, but failing that, we'd like to at least get a splitter in the accessory kit. The I/O ports are located on the top of the case, like the O11D Mini, rather than the front, like the larger O11s. Optional accessories for the Air Mini include a vertical GPU mounting kit and radiator offset brackets. The radiator brackets are simple U-shaped metal strips that allow pushing the radiator slightly further towards the side panel, leaving more room for motherboard or RAM clearance. This is mostly useful for boards in 7-slot mode, as 5-slot mode already gives extra clearance to the top radiator mount. The brackets haven't appeared on Lian Li's site as of this writing, and given their simplicity, they should have just been packed in with the case. Although the stock fans in the O11 Air Mini are mounted to the front and rear of the case in a conventional layout, the case retains its side intake vents of past O11 models. Out of the box, these vents are covered with metal plates that can be used to mount additional SSDs. There's a possibility that removing these plates would encourage some passive airflow as well as incoming air moves past them, so we have some thermal tests for that arrangement coming up in a moment. The bottom of the case also contains a set of fan mounts, but these are only 2 centimeters above the table surface as opposed to 2.5 centimeters in the original O11 and 3.3 centimeters in the O11 XL, plus a few millimeters for the fan tray. This isn't a dimension that should scale with case size, and Lian Li's choice here is an odd one, so we question some of the attention to detail. The front fans are mounted on 2 separate fan trays. Removable trays are good, but we would prefer it to be a single unit. 2 trays means twice as many screws, 4 total, and more parts to line up when installing a radiator. Radiators also can only be installed on the inside surface of the tray. Maximum radiator supports 280mm for the front, the top, and the bottom mounts, and 240mm for the side mount. The front and top mounts are the most usable, as mounting a radiator on the side or the bottom will obstruct cable cutouts, but fitting a top radiator of any size is far easier in 5-slot mode than in 7-slot mode. The top does have fan rails for 120 and 140mm fans that extend a full 360mm, but the radiators of this size will not fit due to overhang. Installing multiple radiators of maximum size simultaneously is possible, but with very little room to spare. Get hands-on with the case and plan carefully before you order a load of open-loop hardware for this one. Time to start talking about some of the thermal testing. We had gotten through most of our testing a couple weeks ago with the original panels before we received word that Lian Li would be changing them for the final release. Unfortunately, this meant we had to toss most of the results because they became irrelevant. Those panels won't be sold to the public, but we'll include some of the results from a basic torture test to demonstrate the degree of improvement that was made. We planned a suite of additional tests after our first set of results were lackluster for the O11 Air Mini, but the new panels improved thermals enough that we limited ourselves to one additional test with a front intake fan moved to the bottom of the case, benefiting, in theory, the GPU. The O11 Air Mini is one of the only O11 family cases we've tested that comes with stock fans. It actually comes with more stock fans than its larger alternative, the O11 Air. This means that our stock tests for this case are truly stock tests, unlike the O11 Dynamic and the O11 XL, where we were forced to add aftermarket fans for testing because they don't want to include any. With a stock fan setup, average CPU temperature was 44 degrees Celsius over ambient, and in our full system torture test, removing the front panel didn't affect this average much, which indicates that it's not that obstructive, but using older, less ventilated panels that won't go to the public surged that average massively up to 57 degrees. That's a 13-degree increase just by changing the panels. So this was a good move by Lian Li. We ran this test multiple times with both sets of panels to validate and verify, and the numbers were accurate and returned multiple times the same. The new panels are a huge improvement overall, so that's good. Mileage will vary, of course, based on the components, the coolers, the software used, but the 5-degree improvement claimed by Lian Li is more than possible with a tower cooler, and with at least our specific setup, it ended up being even better. Finally, moving the bottom front intake fan to the bottom of the case underneath the GPU raised the CPU average up to 52 degrees. We were forced to leave the other front intake fan where it was though, since there are exactly 2 positions available for 140mm intake fans in the front, and incrementally adjusting them up or down is not possible. 44 degrees is an excellent score comparatively versus the rest of the database, and that puts the Air Mini alongside the Raven RV02 and the Lian 2 Mesh in this category, and significantly improved versus the full-sized O11 Air's 50-degree average. There's no secret behind this result. The case has a front mesh panel, an intake fan directly in front of the CPU cooler, and an exhaust fan directly behind it. The case, importantly, is also short, allowing air to immediately get into the components from the front. The ventilated top panel should also help to prevent heat building up, even without the case fans running at maximum speed. During the same torture test, the GPU averaged 59 degrees with a slight reduction down to 57 degrees average for the front panel removed test. The result recorded using the old panels was within margin of error at 58 degrees average, and we ran the torture test on the original review sample twice, and the GPU averaged 59 degrees both times. So we can safely say that 58 degrees as a result is just the test variance rather than a real improvement here. Moving the intake fan to the bottom of the case didn't help at all here, with a resulting average of 60 degrees, making this configuration a total bust, sadly. There's little clearance underneath the case, so active intake from this position doesn't offer any improvement over front intake, at least with our card. This eliminates most of the obvious options for improving GPU thermals, other than just stuffing more fans in the case. We left the side plates covering the side fan mounts in place for all testing, but opening these up could be a way to draw more cool air in. 59 degrees places the O11 Air Mini surprisingly far towards the bad end of the scale. Room ambient for these tests is held just over 20 degrees, and the GPU we use for testing limits itself to 83 degrees unless there's severe thermal runaway, and we do manually control the fans, but that's when you start to see heavier clock dropping. So 59 degrees, considering we're looking at delta T over ambient, is close to as bad as it gets. Even the original O11 Air averaged 57 degrees. As always, results will vary based on components, but the extra wide MSI twin Frozer cooler on our card effectively seals off the bottom half of the chassis, so larger cards will do the same thing. The case legs are too short to allow much airflow passively through the bottom, while the front intake fan blows directly back against the card's exhaust and can't be moved down any further. With this card in this case, good cooling would require a change, like adding intake fans to the side mount. The Firestrike Extreme test result confirmed the outcome of the torture test with a GPU average of 60 degrees. Again, that's among the worst results on the chart, tied with closed-off cases like the Bitphoenix Enso and cases with sparse stock fan mounts like the Mesh IC. The normal O11 Air scored close to its torture test results as well, averaging 58 degrees. This generally isn't a good result for the Air Mini. Rendering the custom GN Monkey head scene and blender on the CPU resulted in an average of 36 degrees above ambient, another strong CPU result for the case. The O11 Air averaged 39 degrees, while the Mini's result is closer to mesh-fronted cases that we've reviewed positively, like the Mesh 2 Compact and the PureBase 500DX. Using the GPU for rendering instead, average GPU temperature was 27 degrees. This is a less intense workload, the CPU is not doing much, and so the average is much lower. But the Air Mini's position on the chart is still close to the original Air, a case that shipped with just 2 120mm fans and also had issues with its front panel intake. Moving on to standardized fan testing. In this instance, the stock fan arrangement was identical to our standardized fan arrangement. There's 2 140mm intakes and 1 120mm exhaust, so replacing the Lian Li fans with a Noctua set resulted in a slightly higher CPU temperature. That was 46 degrees, and that puts the O11 Air Mini on the same level as the 4000D Airflow and the 500DX in this test. The front panel is well ventilated, but the stock fans are what make the Air Mini so exceptional on this torture test chart. The standardized set of fans did improve GPU temperatures to an average of 56 degrees. Still, that's poor compared to the rest of the chart. The Lian Li Lian 215 scored 54 degrees by the same company, with a more favorable CPU temperature as well. With the old case panels, we measured a noise level of 45.6 dBA, but using the new, more open panels, dropped that to 44.6. That's not an audible difference. It doesn't really matter as an end user, but it's another demonstration of the improved airflow. Reducing the noise level to our 36 dBA threshold required reducing the case fans to 58% speed. Even with that reduction in fan speed, CPU temperatures maintained an impressively low average of 48 degrees, one of the best we've seen in this test alongside the Fractal Torrent and the Lian 215. Reducing the fan speed did the GPU performance no favors here, but it didn't get much worse either, capping out at 60 degrees average. Concluding then, the O11 Air Mini is an improvement in both the design and the functionality versus the original O11 Air. That'd be the taller ATX one that we weren't big fans of when it launched, and versus the O11D Mini. The changes versus the O11D Mini are pretty substantial. This natively supports ATX hardware that includes an ATX power supply, whereas the O11D Mini did not support an ATX power supply, period, and the ATX motherboard support required add-ons. Assuming this actually does sell for the $110 MSRP when it launches late this year, given the performance overall, it's an okay buy. It needs improvement. We'll go over that shortly. It's definitely preferable to the closed-off, no stock fans O11D Mini, which is currently going for $120 on Amazon. GPU thermals, though, were weak overall. It just didn't do that well. The 3D Mark testing, which is a gaming stand-in benchmark we do, didn't place the GPU in a good spot. It was at the worst end of the chart, so that needs some work. That is contingent on the GPU design, but our GPU design isn't abnormal. So there needs to be an improvement there. We think that a lot of this has to do with the height of the legs for the case, where since they've brought it down for some reason and scaled down the leg standoff height, maybe to screw with the leader sizing math, if they include that in there. But since they brought the case down to be close to the table, you lose some of the, actually really close to the table, because of the presence of the fan and radiator cages and the filter and all the stuff down there. Because of that, there's a lot of loss of ability to get air in through the bottom of the case efficiently. And that's proven with our test where we moved a fan to the bottom of the case. So getting good GPU cooling into the Air Mini requires some work. The CPU cooling is good, actually. It does extremely well in some of the tests. It's one of the best in some of the tests for CPU cooling. But for GPU, we recommend experimenting with side intake vents or adding additional fans to the case. As it is, large air-cooled GPUs don't stand much of a chance in this case. You'll be okay in a sense. It's just you won't be at the good end of the chart. It's possible that Lian Li could have helped matters with the longer case legs, but that's not a change that you necessarily want to make, although you could just put them each on a small block of wood and that would sort of handle that. Now, we did just publish another review of a $110 case, and that was the NZXT H510 Flow. In that review, we concluded that the price for the NZXT H510 Flow was too high for what it was. The O11 Air Mini isn't a clear winner in thermal performance, but there are more factors to consider, and it did do well in CPU, to be fair. We like the dual chamber design of the O11 family. It's relatively small. The amount of space that it creates behind the motherboard tray is luxurious. The ability to shift the rear panel down with small form factor motherboards is clever, and it's expensive for Lian Li to add all these small features and modularity. Overall, this is a design that we're more willing to spend $110 on, as opposed to, for example, the NZXT H510 Flow, which is a 3 or 4 year old case design that's been remade and remade 2 or 3 times now. And it's just not particularly impressive, and they're better alternatives. If you wanted the ATX style standard sized case, the big problem we had with the H510 Flow was that you can get something like a 4000D for significantly cheaper at like $80. And it's basically better in most of the aspects, or equivalent in some of them, like the obsession with minimalism in design. So the feature set isn't anywhere close to what the O11 Air Mini here is offering, and the H510 Flow ended up just being a lazy refresh of a case by NZXT with too high of a price. This case is workable. We like a lot of features about it, just went through the list of those. GPU is the biggest weak point, and then the shearing the heads off of the screws, that, Lian Li, you probably need to stop doing that. That's not cool. It's risky. End up with a piece of screw in the case and short something and kill the board or whatever, or you just have to get a new screw, which is inconvenient. So that needs to be fixed, but that's the biggest fit and finish issue we've ever seen out of Lian Li, at least in the last year or so. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly by grabbing things like mod mats, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus where you can get behind the scenes videos, and we'll see you all next time.